Hey, what's up, YouTube fans? So, what I wanted to talk about in this video, right, is how what's important to understand in conjunction with understanding the evolutionary reducibility of species, right, showing that that various biological systems are not irreducibly complex, right? What also is important to understand in conjunction with that is the developmental reducibility of living things, right? Because, a lot of times, a lot of people will, they'll understand, they'll be able to understand like the steps along the way, like all the way from single-celled organism to human, right? And how each of those steps in its own right would work. Each step in its own right would give a useful function, and they'll even be able to understand like the process of natural selection. And yet it'll still be hard for them to wrap their head around how you could evolve all the way from single-celled organism to a human, right? Largely because they don't grasp, how could all of the necessary inheritable variations that had to occur along the way from single-celled organism to human, how can those have all occurred? But see, for those people, what's important to understand then, right, is that even in the case of us humans, right, we start out in our earliest stages of development as single-celled organisms, right? In your earliest stage of development, when you're called a zygote, you're a single cell, right? Not even a clump of cells, just one single cell, right? That's what you are in your earliest stages of development. And from there, you grow and develop all of the features that you have on the multicellular level, right? Because the genetic instructions for building all of those features exist all the way down on the cellular level, right? And so each step along the way from single-celled organism to human, every single inheritable variation along the way that had to occur can all be started all the way down at the cellular level, and mainly all the way down at the molecular level, right? But part of what can create the illusion that it couldn't have all been down at the cellular level, each step of the way from single-celled organism to human, what can create the illusion that the inheritable variations couldn't have all started down at the cellular level is that a human zygote cannot on its own develop into the form that a human has when we're born. And the same can be said of many other organisms, right? Many other species, right? A zygote cannot on its own develop into the form a baby has when it comes out. And I mean, there still is a lot of development, though, that happens even after you're born to get to the form that you have as an adult. And by that point, you mainly don't need the mother, although even with that, there is some amount of relying on the mother to take care of you. We have mammary glands so the mother can feed you. And so the zygote has dependency in its development on various multicellular anatomical features that the mother has, right? Features that are themselves multicellular in order to undergo its development. And not to mention that that there's multicellular anatomical features that both the male and female need to have in order to produce a human zygote, right? But see, this is the thing, though. All of those anatomical features that the mother needs to have to facilitate the zygote's development and the anatomical features that the male and female need to have to produce a zygote to begin with, all of that, the instructions for building that is itself in the zygote, right? Which is why the zygote develops all of those same features, except that it differs for male and female, right? But for like the male versus female, it develops all of the whole reproductive anatomy of a female if it's a female, and for a male if it's a male, right? And then furthermore, the reproductive anatomy is itself evolutionarily reducible, right? It can be broken down into a series of several steps, each useful in its own right. And we get a good idea of how each of these steps would work from creatures still alive today that reproduce in that way, right? And we see from them that each of those steps would itself work, right? And much like is so often the case with showing the evolutionary reducibility of biological systems, even though we currently have dependency on some of these features of the mother's reproductive anatomy to grow and develop, that dependency could itself evolve after we already had those anatomical features in the mother, right? And so when those anatomical features were first evolved, we wouldn't have a dependency on them, but they would just give advantage over other organisms in having higher odds of successfully passing our genes on to the next generation. Only later, after each of those anatomical features is evolved, only later do each of them eventually evolve dependency on the features, right? And furthermore, what also supports this, right, is that many creatures which have significantly different reproductive methods, right, still share much of their fundamental anatomy in terms, like with us, in terms of their skeletal system, digestive system, etc., right? Therefore showing that when those features were first evolved, it didn't actually require that our ancestors have the reproductive system that we now have. It didn't actually require that, right? So like, for example, birds, birds, they obviously have very different reproductive methods from us, right? They lay eggs, right? And yet they still share a lot in common with us in terms of their skeletal structure, their digestive system, circulatory system, etc., right? Showing that those earlier steps of evolving all of those fundamental things of those systems, right, could have happened before we had the current reproductive system we have now, where we give live birth, right? And I've talked about it on another video I made where it was titled "The Evolutionary Reducibility of the Human Reproductive System," and that can be found in a playlist I have called "Evolutionary Reducibility of Biological Systems." So you could see that if you want to learn more on like the specifics of the evolutionary reducibility of the reproductive anatomy, like the steps of it, right? And also I did one on like the evolutionary reducibility of the behaviors involved with having sex, right? Because that in of itself can be broken down into a series of steps, each useful in its own right. And so we therefore can show, right, that even with the reproductive anatomy, right, that can be reduced, right, and the dependency on our current reproductive system can be evolved later, right, and then if you want to make the argument of like, oh, well, there's a lot that we share in common with a chicken, but there's still a lot that we don't, and even a platypus, which it lays eggs and is even a mammal, but there's obviously still a lot that a platypus doesn't share in common with us. And so if you want to argue like so a lot of those features couldn't have ever developed without the reproductive anatomy that we now have, you wouldn't necessarily be right, but just for the sake of argument, then those features can be evolved only after that reproductive anatomy is in place, and that reproductive anatomy itself can still get started. The inheritable variations for that can still get started on the cellular level, and then the further changes can also get started on the cellular level, right? And so every step of the way, right, all the way from single-celled organism to human, the inheritable variations can get started all the way down at the cellular level, mainly down at the molecular level, changes all the way down at the molecular level. And then we furthermore understand, right, how the genetic instructions, the genetic instructions code for the not just the shape of features, the size of features, the contents of features, but even the number of the features, the positioning of features. All of that is coded for by the genetic instructions, and so all of that can be changed via genetic mutations, right? And there are various mechanisms through which genetic mutations happen. Some genetic mutations can add more genetic information into the genome, such as duplications, and people will complain like, oh, that's already in there, so that doesn't count. But if you look at our body, you see a lot of repeat. You see that the same things are used again and again and again, right? So many ribs, so many vertebrae, so many bones in general. We see that the same parts are used again and again and again and specialized in different ways. And in the earliest stages of development, we actually have special cells which can develop into any kind of cell. They don't start out as any specific kind, but they have the ability to develop into any kind of cell, whether it be bone cell, blood cell, etc., nerve cell, whatever. It can develop into any specific type of cell. And almost every single cell in the body has the same genetic instructions. And so the cells in your hands have within them the genetic instructions for how to make an eye, and the cells in your eyes have within them the genetic instructions for how to make hands, right? So, that's all for now. See you guys.